Welcome, everyone. As we continue to settle into this space, I just wanted to point out the QR code in the middle of your table there. It's a link to a very, very brief survey. We just asked that at the end of this event, if you could please scan that and give us some feedback on tonight's programming, which will help shape future programming. So we would really appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, thank you for joining us tonight for our panel discussion on the Synod on Synodality. I'm your co-host, Colleen Dulle, one of the assistant chaplains here at St. Thomas More.
Helping Pauline here is Alan, as host as well for tonight, assistant chaplain here at St. Thomas More.
So synodality is described as the ideal and desired way of operating within the Catholic Church in order to discover new paths for spiritual renewal within our global church. It's a relationally oriented way for bishops, church officials, and the laity to listen to each other and work together in service of God's mission, guided and led by the Holy Spirit. In that respect, the Synod on Synodality was a distinct initiative begun by Pope Francis that took place from 2021 to 2024. Selected church leaders, theologians, and lay people were invited to a process of listening, reflection, dialogue, and prayer on the Catholic Church's journey since Vatican II. The three key themes for the Synod were communion, participation, and mission. So to help us unpack the relevance and historical meaning of this Synod on Synodality, we have three unique perspectives on our panel.
It is my honor to introduce our esteemed panelists. The first panelist that we have is Dr. Massimo Faggioli. Dr. Massimo Faggioli is a professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University. He has a column in Croix International and a contributing writer for Commonweal and the Italian magazine Il Regno. Among his recent publications are Theology in Catholic Higher Education, Beyond Our Identity Crisis, published in 2024, and Global Catholicism Between Disruption and Encounter, co-authored with Bryan Froehle, 2024 as well. Welcome. Our second panelist is Colleen Dulle. She is a multimedia journalist covering Catholic and Vatican news. In her current position as Associate Editor at American Media, Colleen writes and edits Vatican news and analysis pieces, and hosts and produces the weekly news podcast, Inside the Vatican. Her forthcoming book, Struck Down, Not Destroyed, on the spiritual crisis that result from reporting on the endemic problems of the Catholic Church, will be published by Penguin Random House in August 2025. So looking forward to it.
Thanks.
And our last panelist, Julia Oseka. She is a senior pursuing a double major in physics and theology at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. In 2023, she served as a delegate from the Archdiocese of Philadelphia to the continental stage of the Synod on Synodality. She participated in a continental debrief session and contributed to the review process of the final document of the continental stage for North America. Later in the year, Julia was nominated as a North American non-bishop member, becoming the youngest woman in the assembly. Let us welcome our panelists.
As we begin our initial questions for our panelists, we are going to flip through some photos so that you get a visual sense of the Synod gathering. Our first question is for Colleen. As a journalist, what were your observations about this particular Synod? What made it different than other Synods in the past? And if you're willing to share, was there a particular event that was not widely reported on?
Sure. To answer this question, I have to gauge whether people have a base understanding of what a synod is. Raise your hand if you know what a synod is. Okay, that's a decent turnout. All right, then I'll go forward with saying what was different about this one, and I'll try to draw out, some of what it used to be like. This synod was very different from past ones. First and foremost, because it involved a lot more listening and consultation before the actual Roman assembly. So this is something that Pope Francis in his synods has slowly been expanding. We saw a little bit of it before the Synod on the Amazon. We saw a decent amount of it before the Synod on the Family, which took place, like the Synod on Synodality, over 2 years and involved some meetings of families to kind of gather feedback about what they thought that they needed from the church. As you guys just heard, this synodal process began in 2021 with an invitation to the whole church to participate in listening sessions. And these revolved around, like they said, the themes of communion, participation, and mission, but really they were pretty open-ended. Like, a lot of things came up. And so, there were not taboo topics. People could raise anything that they thought maybe the church needed to hear or that they wanted to hear from the church. Those responses were then gathered in, first, at least in the United States, in the dioceses, then in regions, and then they were synthesized at the national level, and then at the continental level, which for us in North America was just the US and Canada. Julia can probably tell you more about that since she was there. And then we went on to the Roman phase, which Julia can also tell you about since she was there. At the Roman phase, this is where it looked really, really different from past synods. So whereas in the past, and I'm so sorry to the organizers of those past synods, I had heard that it was you sat in kind of an auditorium style room. There were all the cardinals in the front, then the bishops, and then, the lay people and other auditors in the back. I've heard that people dozed off pretty regularly in those. They were tasked with usually drafting a papal document, but oftentimes when they would go in, a draft already existed and they were just suggesting changes. This time, at the beginning of this assembly, Cardinal Grech, one of the organizers, was asked about what he was going in with on his sheet of paper, and he held up a blank sheet of paper and said this. And the synod room was set up completely differently. There's probably some pictures that have been shown already. I haven't been looking. Yeah, of these round tables, right? And so you have everybody in small discussion groups of like 10 to 12 people. I think there were 36 of them. And as you can see, Pope Francis is at one just like everybody else. He had maybe a 6-inch little stage that his was up on. But yeah, it was discussion style. It was totally different from this kind of past, very much passive listening type of thing. What else can I say? On the story that was less reported, and here I'm going to be shamelessly self-promotional, one story that I reported in the Synod was that at the beginning, there were these updates given from study groups. So after the first synodal meeting, Roman session in 2023, there were a number of subjects on which the participants couldn't reach consensus, and so they asked for them to be delegated to groups for further study. One of these concerned women in ministry. So the actual title was a little bit broader than that, but one of the issues that it caught a lot of attention for was that it was considering the possible admittance of women to the diaconate. And so this got a lot of attention. People were really curious about it. And when the update was given, strangely, the members of the group were not disclosed. That raised a lot of questions among Synod participants, and so they asked for a chance to dialogue with Cardinal Fernandez, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith's prefect, and they said, okay, we'll be given an opportunity on October 18th to do that. October 18th comes along, and Cardinal Fernandez is not there, nor is his deputy. And actually the folks who do come to it are two sort of junior officials of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith who tell everyone in the room to line up in 2 separate lines to come up individually for a half sheet of paper with an email address on it to which they can send their questions. And people are kind of aghast at this, especially since they walked in thinking it would be a dialogue. And so one woman theologian stood up and said, I'll pass out the papers. You guys sit down and please take our questions. And it became clear that no answers were really forthcoming. And so mostly the Synod delegates got up and voiced their displeasure at the situation. Anyway, the reason I bring it up as something that was little reported is because that was a closed-door meeting, but people felt so strongly about this that some of them were willing to talk to a reporter like me. And so I reported all the details of that. And actually that evening, Cardinal Fernandez said, okay, you know what? I will reschedule. We'll have another meeting. And the Vatican recorded the audio of that entire meeting, published it, to the chagrin of some participants who were speaking freely in it and who hadn't known it would be published. And after that came out, a colleague of mine who's good at AI used AI to transcribe this like multi-language conversation, and then we edited it, used our various language skills that we could cobble together from the staff, and so we have published a full transcript of that. So yeah, the study group 5 affair is what I would point to as the little reported thing that I would like to highlight reporting on.
Thank you for that very fascinating snapshot from the Synod.
I hope it wasn't too long.
No, perfect, thank you. So Massimo, our next question is for you. As an ecclesiologist, what were the social and political conditions which led Pope Francis to call the Synod, and was there any present in history for a Synod of this nature?
Yes, so my answer will be in 3 parts, like a Jesuit-educated scholar. So the first is that the Synod cannot be understood without the history of the abuse crisis. This is, we should not be romantic about the Synod. It's something that came up because of the Holy Spirit. It's something that comes out of the trauma that some churches especially experience, and that's why some synodal experiences happen in some national churches even before 2021. The Synod in Germany, the Plenary Council in Australia, so there's something, so that is a trigger that is under-acknowledged in the official statements, documents of the Synod for obvious reasons, but this is really part of the historical context. The second is these last few years. So as Colleen said, so Pope Francis has experimented with synods from the beginning. The first synod on family and marriage of 2014, 2015. I think there's an acceleration in 2019 with the synod for the Amazon region, and 2020, the whole preparation of the synod happens under the shadow of the pandemic, which delays the synod, but it's also the beginning of a global disruption of the international order, which starts soon after Pope Francis is elected, 2014, accelerates 2016 with Brexit, with Trump won, and then we have seen during the celebration of the 2 assemblies an acceleration of this disruption with the war in Ukraine, with Israel, and then with what has happening in this country in these last few months. And so that is really part of the picture, and it's important. Why? Because we should keep in mind the parallel with the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. The real difference is that Vatican II happens on the wave in the context of the golden age of democracies. It's the age of the reconstruction of Europe after World War II, the second wave of democracies because of the end of the colonial empires. It's the thaw with the Soviet Union and so on. So Vatican II can afford to swim in a certain current. Right now, the Synod swims exactly against the current. That's the total difference, I think, which explains why some countries have been more eager or more advanced in synodality. Some others have done less for different reasons. Third answer is this. So to understand the importance of synodality, the opportunities and the risks, I think there are two precedents centuries before. Two big moments of crisis in church history. One is the 15th century, the age of conciliarism, when there is a series of formal schisms, multiple popes, 2 popes, 3 popes, and so on. And so conciliarism is the emergency situation, the emergency fix. But it's a very short season, and the papacy wins back everything with interests. And something similar happens in the 18th century. Second half of the 18th century, just before the French Revolution, when episcopalism, Gallicanism, all these experiments for a more national, democratic or pre-democratic governance, they try, and again, they are defeated by the papacy. And without knowing that, Napoleon helps the papacy a lot. He didn't know that, but that's what. So that's important. Why? Because we don't know if synodality is something that, like Vatican II, opens a long movement, a new age, a long wave of changes in the church, or if it's just an emergency fix, like conciliarism in the 1420s, 1450s, or episcopalism in the 1760s, 1780s, or that's the biggest question, I think. And so all these efforts changing the governance of the church are always influenced by the social political context, and they contribute to that, I think, also. So that's how I see the big picture.
Thank you, Massimo, for that, for widening our understanding of the reasons and factors that contribute to the creation of the Synod. Our next question is for Julia. Julia, please share your experience as a student delegate. How were you chosen to attend the Synod in Synodality, both the Roman and Continental? I heard from Colleen. And also, is there a particular memory that stays with you after attending the meetings?
Right. So the way in which I came to be a member of the Synod is quite strange, as you can imagine, as a college student participating in such a grand assembly. It came out in a synodal way, I'd like to think. So when Pope Francis first convened the Synod in 2021, as it has just been stated, he called all of the local communities into a consultation period. Those local communities were parishes, but also groups within parishes, any Catholic or Christian community that might be a campus ministry, for example. And in my case, I was a freshman in college, a first-year student at St. Joseph's University. We are a Jesuit institution, but I don't have 3 points for this answer. But our campus ministers, along with campus ministers from other Catholic universities and colleges in Philadelphia area, decided to undertake this question that Pope Francis directed to us, and conduct those listening sessions, as they were called at the time. And more than just conduct them individually on each campus, they decided that it would be good to also combine them and create that space for students to also consult within each other, their campuses, so students from different universities as well. So I attended first of those listening sessions, just as many of my classmates did on my campus at SJU. And then was asked to sort of share my experience with that listening session, share my experience with the church at this cross-campus listening session that was held at La Salle later that year, which was attended by the Archbishop of Philadelphia, Nelson Perez. And he was there as a listener. The students were really participating and talking and sharing. And the whole thing was facilitated by our faculty and staff. That was the first stage of the synod. So we were all just sharing with each other, talking. There was an artist who was making art based on what we were talking about. Some of our faculty and staff wrote a synthesis report of our findings and our discussions to be submitted to our Archdiocese and USCCB as well as a part of that official process. And then came the second stage of the synod, which was the continental stage, also alluded to previously. And our continental region consisted of the United States, so USCCB, and CCCB, so Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, only those two countries. And actually, our continental region was the only one that held those continental stage consultations, those sessions via Zoom and not in person. And that had an advantage. It gave us an advantage because dioceses and local churches could have sent more delegates from each of the dioceses. So our Archbishop Nelson Perez, having attended this listening session with over 100 college students, decided that it would be quite fitting to also have a college student representing the Archdiocese at the continental stage, which I think was a very smart thing to decide. And I ended up being that person. Why, I don't know, but that was the case. So I logged in to that Zoom session, one of the 12, I believe, Zoom sessions that were held as a part of this continental stage, shared at that point not only my own reflections, not even the reflections of my peers, but I was there representing the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, so I have obviously studied the synthesis reports of our diocese and those smaller groups also who submitted them. Within a small group in a setting that is called Conversation in the Spirit. I don't know if that was name dropped yet, but that is a pretty essential method through which the synod consultations were conducted at every level, really. And after that, the synod team at the USCCB reached out to me, as you have heard in my intro, to be a representative of my Zoom session to like a debrief Zoom session, which gathered basically delegates from all of those 12 Zoom calls so that we could, share our notes and debrief and maybe share what the vibe was during our session. And I was there too. And later on, I also got an email to read the draft of the Continental Stage document. So that was basically a synthesis of that Continental Stage in USCCB concretely, so what was being said, but also CCCB because those two were combined. And what happened later was another email. There was a lot of emails asking if I'd be free for the 2 Octobers, potentially, should I be nominated to be a non-bishop delegate. And that happened after a very important change. Also something that Colleen alluded to, and Dr. Faggioli, I believe, as well, the fact that participation during this synod and synodality was broadened significantly in comparison to what we've seen in the previous synods. On April in 2023, I believe, Pope Francis decided to open up and enlarge that group of synod members to also include non-bishop members. Because previously, as Colleen said, only bishops could actively participate in the synod sessions, so could vote and talk and do all the member things, I guess. This time around, Pope Francis said, well, let us spice things up and add some non-bishop members too. He asked for 20 names from each of the continental region, out of which 10 were chosen. And those were not only lay people, but also women and men religious and priests as well. On top of that, he also delegated like his own delegates, which is also quite interesting. So I was among those 20 names, and then I got another email saying that I ended up being among those 10 non-bishop members from the North American region. So that's how I ended up being a non-bishop North American delegate. And I'm not even North American. I'm Polish. So that rose a lot of question marks for a lot of people, me included. But I guess those are surprises of synodality. And one thing that stuck with me, one story, that was the second part of this question. I've been thinking about it because there were so many moments during those 2 months. So I was there for 2 Octobers in 2023 and this past October in 2024. But I think my favorite moment, maybe not the most significant, but I think one of the most telling moments of what this assembly was the very beginning of the second session. So at the beginning of this October, all of the delegates and experts and facilitators and all other people involved gathered again in Rome. We started with a retreat, and Father, now Cardinal Timothy Ratcliffe, along with Mother Angelini, were conducting this retreat. And we open up with the first day. We have this profound session. You know, Cardinal Ratcliffe is sharing his amazing thoughts. All of us are just taking it all in and being retreatants and preparing ourselves spiritually for the session that is to come. And this wonderful conference is ended with a request to go out of the hall in silence and remain with those words and really contemplate them, maybe pray with them, do some notes. And this is the very first thing we do together after coming back after the year. So we all go out and talk. And there was no silence. Everyone was just greeting each other and hugging each other and saying hi to each other and talking about that, you know, beautiful conference that we just witnessed as well. But I think that the human urge to really greet each other and rejoice in seeing each other again says a lot about the relationships that we have been building in the Synod. So that was one of my favorite moments.
Thank you, Julia, for that insider account of being a delegate, and also I think being a very important voice, especially reflecting the young adult voices similar to the college and graduate students here. So thank you for representing them. I remember also when we were here, I think 2021, when we had that consultation listening sessions. I know students brought a lot of what brought them joy, how the church brought them joy, and also they brought their hopes. And alongside the hopes is some of the issues that they shared boldly, I would say. So my next question to all of you, or whoever wants to answer, what were the most pressing issues discussed at the Synod?
Anybody want to take it? All right, I'll do it. I'll just share one, and then if you guys want to jump in with yours, go ahead. Yeah, I can't believe I forgot to say that this was the first one that women could vote in. I think I got carried away with the study group 5 thing, sorry. But yeah, women in the church was a thing that came up in every continental report. It came up, I would say, in probably almost every local report. Just this acknowledgement that, you know, women make up the majority of the people in the pews. They're the ones holding a lot of jobs within chanceries, and yet they often don't have a role in some of the key decision making that happens in your diocese, in your parish, etc. And so there was this real cry from just all over the church for the contributions of women to be better recognized and for them to be better incorporated into the decision-making structures of the Catholic Church. And that came out very strongly in the final document from the first session and, of course, the final document from this session as well, which I assume that we'll talk more about later.
So I think that, I mean, what Colleen has said is clearly issue number one. I would say for the Western part of the world, it's a little different in other areas. But so what is special of this synod is that it's a meta-synod. So it's a synod on how to be a synod in the context of Pope Francis spicing up things during the project of the reform of the Roman Curia, which lasted the entire duration almost of his pontificate. But also, the problem is the synodality is a neologism, so it's a new word that comes from an original, Greek name, synodos, and centuries later we had an adjective, synodal, and finally we came up with a noun, synodality. And so the overarching question is what it means to be a synodal church. And so that's what has been in the mind of Francis, I think, in a effort to rediscuss a lot of institutions and of concepts that were taken for granted. So as of now, we don't know if the synod is still called the Synod of Bishops or it's called the Synod period. So we don't know. I mean, it's not, if you read some documents, some voices, they will tell you something. But as a matter of fact, this synod has not been a synod of bishops. It's been a synod with bishops, which is different. So that's, I think, so, and from this, the kind of decisions, the way in which the decisions on women, or on everything will be made, descend from this idea of, ultimately, of who is in charge of making big decisions in the Catholic Church. Because we are exiting the first 2,000 years when it was clear that there was the Pope and the bishops. And synods were local, but there's never been anything like this at the central level. And so the big question is, are we going to see some changes in the way the church is governed only locally, more synodality at the local level, which is more likely to happen, I think, or it has already happened, or at the central level, is there going to be a synod that the Pope needs to consult or needs to hear? That's not clear at all. So that's why the synod continues in some sense. So, I mean, the first two assemblies have concluded, but I mean, this is something that continues to be part of the discussion, and I'm pretty sure, I mean, this is one of the things that the movie Conclave got wrong, because this is going to be a major part of the agenda of the next conclave. What are we going to do with this thing? I mean, we want someone who continues synodality, or that was a nice dream, but goodbye, and we need to move on with a more traditional kind of thing.
I'd like to maybe zoom out even more, if that's okay. Because I think that what Dr. Faggioli was pointing very correctly and eloquently, those are some structural changes that are definitely very relevant to the Synod. But actually, I think you got the question wrong, because the central question was how to be a synodal church in mission. So there is also this mission part, and that adds this transcendent also question that was prevailing during the assembly especially, and that was defining what is the mission of the Catholic Church, which might seem like an extremely fundamental question, and I think it is very fundamental, but that goes far beyond the structures and who is in charge and who is making decisions, beyond in a sense that it is a very important question to answer globally and on a universal level, but also on the level of local communities. And I think in that context too, maybe pointing out another specific issue that I think was a key issue at the Synod was the relevance of the Catholic Church in today's world and even in our Catholic communities. What is the role of the Church as a structure? And a community of faithful. The thing that really came out of the Synod was the relational nature of the Church, something that we are called to build. The Church that's relational and not merely structural, right? And there can be relationships in the structures as well, obviously. And I think in the context of young people in particular, something that was absolutely pressing, at least in the Philadelphia area, was this notion that young people want to be present in the Church and want to be the now of the Church, want to find a refuge in the Church and want to be welcomed in that Church fully as the full members of the Church. This is a lot of words, but I think it also translated to the issues that were discussed at the assembly, and those are the notions of the inclusivity of the Roman Catholic Church, again, globally and in our local communities too. The notions of participation, both globally, so those structures of decision-making and decision-taking, whatever is the difference between the two, but also locally, so who actually gets to sit at a table and voice their hopes, their dreams, their worries, who gets to be a lector at Mass, who gets to serve during the Mass, you know. I think those are relevant questions on all levels too.
Thank you. That really leads to our next question. As you point out, certainly the diversity, not just within our local church and the church in the North America, but our global church. How are the diversity of the human family, how are those perspectives were taken into account during the Synod, knowing that people come from very different cultural expectations, norms, etc., and how were conflicts dealt with?
You want to talk about how conflicts are dealt with?
Oh, yeah, sure. So during the second session, during one of the interventions, someone said that one of the ways of building communities synodally is via mediation and conflict resolution. And I was talking about it with Dr. Faggioli on our train here. I think that brings up an interesting point because it puts us in the light of truth, where we all know that those synodal meetings were not merely a space where everyone is welcomed and it's a beautiful space of dialogue and we just come together and those ideas are brought up by the Holy Spirit and everyone is satisfied. But it was sometimes conflict resolution was really the way to go and needed to be done. And the way in which we approached it was via this method that I mentioned before, conversation in the Spirit. That was the way in which we conversed in the small circles. So we would first start with a moment of silence and prayer. Well, first we would prepare for that session, right? So we were given questions for discernment or texts, or in the case of General Assembly, that was the Instrumentum Laboris, so the working document with which we are working during the whole session. Then we would come, we would pray, and we would have 3 rounds of sharing/discussion. The first round, nobody would interact with anyone, so we would just state whatever we have prepared in 3 minutes, and the others were listening attentively. Then we would have a moment of silence, And that moment of silence was very often a moment of holding the tension that is just arising in me after having heard something that was, stirring something in me. So we would pray about that too for like 2 minutes. Then we had a second round. And in the second round, again, we would not interject each other. We would not interact with each other directly. But that was the round in which we would voice the resonances. So something that has maybe been voiced by many people in our 11-person roundtable, or questions saying, you said something that really stirred me. I don't necessarily know in what way, in which direction, but I'd love to hear more about what you have just said here, because I just felt something, maybe, a worry, maybe I don't understand what you meant here, and voicing something that maybe surprised me, right? So, I would have never thought about this approach to this particular question. Then we would again have 2 minutes of silence and prayer. And the third round, the final round, was the round of dialogue. So we would engage in dialogue. And now the bishop that has just been questioned by me would have responded, "Oh, Julia, you know what I meant by that." And I would counter question, or I would say, "Oh, thank you for explaining that to me." Or sometimes we would say, "How about we grab coffee together after this and talk a little bit more," if that turns out not to be very relevant to the topic we're discussing. When it comes to the tensions on the higher level, we technically had a person for conflict resolution in the assembly. I don't know if anyone used it because that was kept confidential. But the people from the Synod Secretariat were definitely the people to go to. I did go to such person once, not the conflict resolution person, but a person from the Synod Secretariat, because of something that was personally, said to me, and I didn't feel comfortable with that. So we had those people of contact in case there was something that we couldn't deal with personally. But on the more like structural level, the conversation in the spirit was the way to facilitate that mediation process.
What was the first part of the question?
I think she answered it. It was how are the diverse...
So, this is a big question because, synods historically have decided things. So, I wasn't part of that, so I cannot say what happened there, at the deep level. But, so the synods have been modeled as a cousin of the council, like Vatican II. And just to give one example, at Vatican II, at some point, there were some bishops who said, we cannot condemn anti-Judaism because this is part of the tradition of the church. And others said, no, you're nuts. We should condemn anti-Judaism because in light of what happened in World War II, in light of our history, we should condemn that. And there was a vote, and anti-Semitism was condemned, anti-Judaism was not. That's close parenthesis. So here the question is, in the end, to talk about the issues of our day, someone will have to decide, can the Bible be used to bash gays? Can the Bible be used to tell women you cannot access the Presbyterium? So here, I think that the Synod is very important as long as we do not think that that dynamic is the solution to some problems. So I think we have some problems, and dialogue must be conducive to something. And in the end, the question is, who's going to decide? One man will be a commission, will be the whole synod voting on something. And so that's, so here, I believe the synod was very important because in the final document gave us a theology of synodality at the magisterial level that we did not have before. So that is, I think, the major achievement. Honestly, I'm a little skeptical of over-reliance on HR methods, which make me shiver sometimes, because this is it's not the solution to some problems. Some of them are very urgent, and we cannot wait another century. So we dialogue for 1 century. I mean, so this is something that I believe has to be said as someone who has not been part of any of those commissions, as an historian of the institutions of the church, where the synod is, it seems to me, still in a phase of infancy. So it's saying something. It's not all it will say, it can say, when it's not an infant anymore. That's how I see it.
Thank you. For our next question, as the Synod has a lot of supporters, there are also some people that have criticized it. What are the criticisms of the Synod on synodality, and how did the Church address those concerns?
I'm just here to talk about the conflict. Gosh. I would say one of the major criticisms that was voiced was that synodality is this amorphous thing that none of us understand, and it's just being used as a cover to railroad through a liberal agenda or what have you. I think that the Synod responded very directly to at least the first part of this question by offering in paragraph 28 of the final document a really thought out definition of exactly what synodality is. And from my reporting during the Synod, it was clear to the Synod delegates that they knew that they needed to come up with this. They knew that, we couldn't leave without this, what this was all about being defined. I think one other criticism that was tied to the idea that it was just meant to, push someone's agenda was this idea that the outcomes were predetermined. And that, I think, is totally false. I think that, maybe there's room for some criticism around who was chosen. Like, perhaps they leaned one way ideologically, the majority, although certainly there were notable Synod critics also invited and who were in the room. But the idea that the final document was written going in, I know for a fact from talking to the people who were up until 4 a.m. writing it, that is very much not the case. I'd say that those were two of the biggest ones. And then, there were other criticisms that came from different sectors, right? Everybody wants to see their thing represented or addressed by this body at the center of the church. So, yeah.
Thank you. Colleen, since you already alluded to the final document, if you could please, anyone in the panel, share what some of those takeaways are from that final document and how that applies to people on the local level, parishes here at STM.
I can take that, or start at least, because my favorite thing about the final document is that it wasn't written as a magisterial text. That's my least favorite thing, actually. And the Pope surprised us all and said that, by the way, I'm not writing any follow-up. I'm just going to co-sign it and call it the magisterial text. So reading it might feel awkward, and I want to acknowledge that too, because it wasn't written as a magisterial text, wasn't supposed to be that. But my favorite thing about that, it's something that I think we learned, that the members and people attending the Synod, the assemblies, that was critical in understanding even the concept of moving forward and implementing synodality. And that is the word that appears over and over in the final document in many, many forms, and that's context. So synodality should be contextual. It means that implementing the final document, or more broadly, perhaps more correctly, implementing synodality and synodal way of proceeding, the modus vivendi et operandi, on a global level will look differently than the way of implementing synodality on even the level of the Episcopal Conference. So in many cases, that's a regional level, right? So a country level, or a level of a diocese itself, a singular diocese, or a parish, or a campus ministry, or an STM, right? In many different contexts. And it is important to note that all of those contexts, for as long as they're truly discerned, right? And not just decided, but synodally discerned. So with participation of all those affected in the spirit of subsidiarity and solidarity, those two main pillars of Catholic social teaching, all of those are valid, and they may look completely differently from each other. How St. Joseph's University decides to implement synodality and how STM decides to implement synodality, even though we are quite close to each other. We are both, affiliated with institutions of higher learning. So that would be like my overarching takeaway. I don't know, maybe you would like to add about particular things from the document that are important.
Yeah, the question is how much to limit the list. I would say to start with your question about how it affects folks at St. Thomas More in particular, I would recommend reading the document, maybe put together reading groups. There's sort of a cheat sheet method of reading the Synod final document if you're wondering about practical takeaways, and that is to look for the spots where there are subpoints under a paragraph. Usually those things function like a checklist. And so you'll see those in like the section on bishops, and it'll explain one of the big newsworthy outcomes was this call for there to be sort of performance evaluations for bishops. And so there's a checklist with like points A through F in that paragraph pointing out, okay, here is like kind of what that looks like. Here are the things that we're looking for in, evaluating how a bishop is living synodality, for example. So that's my kind of cheat sheet version. In terms of the big, like, newsy takeaways, I would point to, I'm going to start with my favorite subject, women. It called for all of the possibilities foreseen in canon law for women to be fully implemented. It recognized that, those are not always given full strength everywhere. And so it called for all of those. It used some very strong language around saying that, there should be no impediment to women holding positions of leadership that are allowed in canon law. And it said what comes from the Holy Spirit cannot be stopped. And then it specifically calls for the discernment on the female diaconate to be continued, which sort of surprised me as a reporter because previously Pope Francis had voiced that he didn't think that was ready for a decision yet. But here he is endorsing this document that says, but the discernment should continue. Those aren't opposed to each other, but it was interesting after especially that sort of tense news cycle when he had said no. There's a lot under the role of bishop, under need for changes in canon law to sort of continue this process that Pope Francis has begun in the Roman Curia of separating the authority that's given to someone because of holy orders or because of their role as bishop and the sort of elements of governance that can be appropriately delegated to a layperson, for example. And so there's a canon law commission working. So for those of you who are eagle-eared, there are study groups and commissions. The study groups are for things that there was not totally consensus on. The study commissions are for things that there was consensus on, but that really need like an expert go through and some expert recommendations. So the Canon Law Commission is continuing its work. I think there will be a lot of big recommendations coming out of that. A couple of other things that came out in the final document, I mentioned the performance evaluations. That applies to everyone in ministry, not just bishops. So I think a real step towards accountability. I'm sorry that it's HR language, though. There were also calls for a new ministry of listening and accompaniment, which could be interesting. There was a call for an 11th study group to be created, one on the liturgy and how to make the liturgy more synodal. So I think that's something that could affect people's, regular worship at Mass, which would be really interesting and probably the most jarring change some of us might experience. Gosh, what else? I've written so many news articles about this at this point that it's hard for me to remember every single thing. But yeah, those are a few of the big ones. I'll leave it there.
I think the need for integral development to an integral formation was a big one as well.
Formation.
Yes, and that particularly understood as formation that includes all people in the church. So no more bubbles, no more seminaries on high hills with no access to the real world. No more lay people not being able to interact with their bishop, or, young people having their youth study groups, not interacting with the senior prayer groups in parishes, but really paying attention to creating communities that are integral, intergenerational, and intersectional too. I think that was important as well.
And sorry, if I can continue adding. And one way it wanted that to happen was by making participatory bodies, because we have some of these already, these synodal bodies, mandatory. So like your parish council, your parish finance council, your diocesan pastoral council, for example. And then also it listed in one of those handy dandy checklists things that those groups should be accountable to. And one thing that I found interesting, since, as you've learned, this is my pet subject, was that they need to be transparent about the makeup of men and women who are on them, and also what they're doing, their financial, et cetera.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing those highlights. They were really fascinating and clearly profound, if we can turn them into concrete realities. We would like to open it up for some Q&A from the audience, and our wonderful education coordinator, Colleen, will put the mic around.
So I just wanted to, first of all, thank all of you for your insights. This has been extremely helpful. My name is Dennis, and really, I agree with both of the speakers, the student as well as the professor, in terms of you need structure, but you also need context. You can't run an organization without structure, not just HR, but change management. And so I'm more of a structural person. I'm a process expert. And my question really is, did the Synod go to the very practical thing of recruitment of clergy, not just priests, but also sisters, brothers, others? Because certainly, one of the data that I would look at if I have been on a parish council would be, we don't have as many people to serve. And so local parishes are consolidating because there's just a lack, first of all, of attendance, but also a lack of people to actually administer. That's a very practical one. You're talking about much deeper issues. My mother would love to meet you. She probably is smiling in Des Moines right now. But I want to just get down to, how did you deal with very practical things, like why aren't people wanting to be in the ministry anymore? Did it touch on that? Thank you.
So I think, correct me if I understood you wrong. By recruitment, do you mean focusing or talking about attracting people to ministries within the Catholic Church?
Yeah, sorry, I'm using
Okay. Yeah.
attracting people to go into the ministry as a life
Right. I'd like to see a banner, sort of as for Greek life, recruitment open. St. Charles Seminary. The short answer is no. I think that's because of the understanding of what is one's vocation, and how it is essential for the discernment process to be something that happens obviously within the context of the community, but is one's individual decision and not decided for, our quota for this year is 20% of all boys from Catholic schools go to seminaries. I think that would be quite hurtful. Obviously, that's an over-exaggeration. But I think an answer that might satisfy you maybe in part, would be talking about what did we do wrong so that so many young people, because those would be the people who discern what to do with their lives, right, feel uncomfortable within the Catholic Church structures. And as a result, perhaps they don't feel comfortable going into a ministry within the Catholic Church, which is so intensely related to that formal structure, right? And those would be the conversations about participation, mission, our communion, church being more welcoming, the church being a safe space, which I know is a very broad word that we tend to use a lot, but truly a space, both physically and more virtually, where young people can come, so everyone truly can come as they are, ask questions, those smart questions and those very difficult and provocative questions, not fear for being marginalized within the church, not fear for being kicked out or prevented from receiving the sacraments because of the questions they ask or because of their identity of how they come into the church. And we talked about how to do that. And I think that would have a great effect on how many people, especially young people, decide to become ministers in the Catholic Church.
Just one question, one sentence. This is really a first world problem. Many churches around the world are booming the vocations. And the temptation is to say, well, why don't we spread all of them in different countries? Which is not always easy. And so that's why one universal solution to that is very hard to find, because it doesn't apply in the same way in all different countries.
Yeah, to answer sort of sorry, I gotta hold it. To answer your sort of structural side of the question, the Synod did talk about how to improve seminary formation so that the people who do end up coming out of seminary are better equipped to, serve the church in a synodal way. And so this was something that was delegated to a study group, and it was something that the call was really strong for out of the first Synod session, and then sort of less strong, but because it was being taken up by the study group already in the final document from the second session. But they specifically called for, as Julia mentioned, more women in seminary formation as professors, but also as classmates alongside the seminarians. They want for seminaries to be a more sort of immersed in the community kind of program, rather than, like you said, a city on a hill or whatever. And actually, I did a big sort of investigative project with a bunch of my colleagues for my podcast, where we went into 3 different seminaries and we talked to them about, like, hey, here are the concerns that the Synod is raising about you. Like, what do you think? How is this going? And anyway, I'll say one major thing that has come out of the Synod is that it's called for an overhaul of the Ratio Fundamentalis, which is the document that governs seminary formation, to be redone to reflect synodality. So I think that that's something that will have a ripple effect through seminary, and hopefully will also, kind of transform who then is being drawn to seminaries. But yeah, like Massimo said, this is only a problem in certain parts of the world. That's not to dismiss it. I think that raises especially a real concern for all of these calls of the Synod for more lay people, more lay involvement, because some people are like, I can't even fill the lecture schedule, So yeah, I think also speaking to the question of distributing priests more evenly across the world, there is an interesting section in the final document from the second session that talked about how foreign priests need to be welcomed and sort of be able to put their cultures in dialogue with the one that they're joining, and that their communities need to incorporate their cultural experiences as well. So again, like there are these notes all the way through the Synod document about variation among cultures, about different applications of synodality in different places. And I talked to a woman on the Synod drafting committee, which is not actually the committee that drafts the document, but is the one that oversees the drafting. And she said that a lot of the edits that were proposed specifically called for a little bit more nuance or leeway to be given to local churches to implement things differently, or to take into account that, yeah, the church's realities look very different because it's, again, a global institution.
Thank you so much for wonderful presentation, and also thank you for going and participating in this. I mean, I would fall asleep through the whole thing if I were there. So, I'm an activist. I'm a Catholic activist. I'm a writer. I want to be really hopeful about what's happening. I co-founded the Global Catholic Climate Movement and the Franciscan Action Network. So I want to be real hopeful. But I also remember at the end of Vatican II, there was a document that was issued, and my Latin is terrible, so Massimo, maybe you can help me out with the correct pronunciation of this. It was Nostros Aetate, something like that?
Aetate?
Yes.
Nostra Aetate, yeah.
Say it again so everybody.
Nostra Aetate.
Nostra Aetate. It was considered one of the most revolutionary doctrines in the Catholic Church. It really redefined how our relationship with non-Christian religions like Judaism and Muslim. And it just really was it was a short doctrine. I just recently published an article on the 60th anniversary of it. I did some research. Almost no seminaries teach that doctrine anymore. If I ask people in this room, I wager almost no one in this room has ever heard of that doctrine at this point in time. Benedict pretty much buried the doctrine. And so tell me why I should be hopeful that this is going to make a difference when we went through all this already, and it didn't change anything. I'm also, just so you know, I'm a survivor of sexual assault. And so the fact that I'm sitting in a room here and that I've done all this work with the Catholic Church says something of why I want to still be here. But I have a hard time being hopeful that change is going to come.
So, I mean, I think that a lot of things have changed since Vatican II. Thanks to Vatican II, we tend to be cavalier and to take for granted many, many things. And so I'm convinced that the Synod is the closest thing that Pope Francis could do other than calling Vatican III, which cannot be called today. So I'm very hopeful. On the other hand, I think Nostra Aetate will have a revival this year, many conferences because of the anniversary, because of what's happening in Israel and so on. But so at the same time, and I confess my sins because I've committed them, we should look at Vatican II at the major moments of reform in the Catholic Church without falling into the temptation of nostalgia. So every major moment should be reinterpreted in the context of today. For example, Nostra Aetate talks about Judaism. It never mentions Israel intentionally, which right now is the big question, right? So here we should always build from something that has been given to us from our predecessors, but also in a very different context. For many Catholics in the world, Nostra Aetate, if it means anything, it's not for paragraph 4 on Judaism. That is the least relevant for most Catholics in the global South. So the situation has been turned on its head completely in half a century, right? So here, a lot of things have happened since Vatican II. Pope Francis is a fruit of the Second Vatican Council. I'm in the hope business. I mean, but I mean, hope is different from optimism. Being optimist means that you don't need hope that much. And so we should have less optimism and more hope. That's all.
If I can add to it, maybe it will be of consolation, and thank you for all that you have shared, and thank you for being here too. That is a testimony in itself. I have heard of Nostra Aetate. I've taken 3 classes on it, actually, as an undergrad student. But I'm privileged because there is an Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations at my university, which is a wonderful institution, too. I think that also answering as to how to have hope, Pope Francis actually during the second session of the Synod spoke to us. He was with us like every other day probably, and he spoke to us the other day, and he said that hope is the most humble virtue. And I think those are really, really profound words. One has to really be humble to be hopeful, and that's daring to be hopeful, especially in the world where we see so much abuse and so much news that just drowns us down and drags us down too. However, there are things that happened as on the way in the Synod that are irreversible, or hopefully are, right? The fact that women participate in the Synod, for example, was a huge step, really, and that sets a precedence for women's participation in those processes. The fact that Pope Francis calling for non-bishop members, called particularly for women and young people, also sets a precedence, right? The fact that now we have a female prefect in the Curia, very recently appointed, another precedence, right? And the Synod itself, I think, created this platform for a lot of people from the margins to be able to voice their experiences and be heard in the circles that were closed off from those people previously. And to me, those are sources of hope, great sources of hope.
Hello, my name is Betty Ann Donnelly. I came down for Boston from this. I'm the co-founder and preacher coordinator for the website Catholic Women Preach. And I spoke here previously, last year or the year before. I share in this sense of hope, and I'm very grateful for those members who participated in the Synod, and especially for the cardinals and bishops who are willing to be very practical about implementing synodality as a way of being church in our country to begin with. My understanding is that Cardinal Tobin of Newark has issued a directive about how to implement synodality at the parish level. I was also struck by the fact that Massimo said, this is a very different context from Vatican II, that now this whole synodality is a way of being church. We're swimming against the currents of today's socio-political context, which is absolutely frightening. And it really struck me when you said that, Massimo, that if we really be very intentional about implementing synodality as a way of listening to each other, deep listening to each other, implementing the process of conversations in the Spirit, of a way of listening to each other, that the Catholic Church could be very, very transformational at this very, very difficult time. And I'm so excited that Cardinal McElroy is going to be in D.C.
Right. Thank you so much. This was a lovely panel. So good to hear from you all. So I'm currently doing my senior thesis on synodality, and particularly on the German Synod, and sort of in comparison with the Global Synod. So one of Pope Francis's big mantras about synodality is, quote unquote, the Synod is not a parliament. And now we've exited the Synod with a magisterial document approved by the voting of members. But the Synod still isn't a parliament, question mark. And so the question here is, after the Synod, how do you evaluate that mantra? To what extent do you think it's true? What does he mean by that? Is it a good thing that the Synod is not a parliament? Should it be more? This is just an opportunity to riff on Pope Francis's sort of mantra in this respect.
I can maybe briefly start. I think the first thing that pops into my head is that, there wasn't a proposed document. I forget which one of you said that, but during the previous synods, really the bishops would gather with an instrumentum laboris that was a template for the final document, the final proposal for the synod, right? This time around, the instrumentum laboris was a document guiding us into the sermon process, right? So the final document that we have written, or the writers wrote, and we then modified and then voted on and approved with a 2/3 majority, that very parliamentary setting, if you wish. What came before that voting part, the voting was the day before we ended the synod, right? That was like the least important thing. I would be very surprised, and maybe it's easy to talk retrospectively and think retrospectively about it, if a paragraph would not be voted for, would be voted out of the final document. So the process that brought that meat into the final document was not a process of legislation. It was a process of discernment, which happened in a prayerful setting, which happened after meditation, which happened after consultation, after dialogue, conflict resolution, mediation, right? But most importantly, it happened in the hope that Holy Spirit is guiding this assembly, in the hope that, as Cardinal Radcliffe told us at the beginning, the retreat, this synod hall is the holy ground. I wouldn't dare to call any parliamentary building a holy ground. I think that's a major difference, right? So that's my take on it.
Yes, I mean, the history of parliaments is made of, it's a mix of secular and sacred institution. I mean, all constitutional conventions in the Western tradition, they open often with the prayer, Veni Sancte Spiritus. Okay? So here Pope Francis tends to speak by slogans, which is not a good thing, generally. And what he means is that the church is not a democracy. And he's right, because democracy means the sovereignty of the people. And so the church here, though, the history of the synods and of the councils is a history of votes. And so here he has been cagey in addressing this question, but there is, so here we are changing fundamentally one institution that was made of peers, all bishops, to something else. And so that changes the DNA, and that slogan is effective, but it doesn't address what that means, because I don't think a synod could end up deciding things with people speaking in tongues. I mean, I find it hard to imagine that, but he was worried for the German synod, which was really a German constitution kind of synod. So it was completely opposite to what he had in mind. So here we are trying to find a way, and the question is, what's the mind of the successor of Pope Francis on this? Because much will depend on him, on what is the agenda of the conclave, on this, because it's not sure that the next synod will have non-bishops members. I mean, it's a precedent which would be traumatic to break.
Yes.
But every pope can change almost anything he wants on this particular issue, I think.
My answer has the same kind of contours as y'all's, but I'll just add a little bit. I think that when the Pope says this, he usually follows it up by saying, and I'm sure you know this since it's your whole thing, he says, it's not a parliament where you come in with your ideas of here's what I want, and you're gonna hold your line, and you're coming with like sort of combative attitude, right? No, instead, as Julia explained with Conversations in the Spirit, you're coming in with this attitude towards discerning. And in fact, the Pope took it a step farther by saying, okay, and let's take these things that we know we couldn't agree on, but that we got really kind of tangled up in, let's take them off the table for the second time so that we can go forward. So yeah, I think that he's not referring to like the act of voting. One other interesting thing on that, during the Synod, I interviewed this representative who was a fraternal delegate from one of the other churches, the other Christian churches. He's a Methodist. He represents the World Methodist Council just across the Tiber from the Vatican, actually, and does a ton of like interreligious dialogue stuff ecumenical dialogue stuff with the Vatican, which actually has like really progressed a lot. I wish that our friend who asked about Notre Dame was still here. But he brought up the Synod is not a parliament thing and said, actually, as a Methodist, I don't think he used the word offends me, but I'll say he said that raised attention with him and with some of his fellow Protestants by saying, we do believe that voting in our discernment processes is a legitimate expression of the Holy Spirit. And I would say in the Catholic tradition, we believe that when we vote in a conclave, right? You have this voting process, but it's not totally like the movie Conclave. Like, we really believe that the Holy Spirit is at work with the person who is elected, or at least that is what, the church teaches. So yeah, that's just my 2 cents to add to that.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you everyone for attending tonight's event. We also want to thank those who joined us via live stream. Thank you for joining us. And if you have a question that you weren't able to ask, our panelists, I would assume, will be available after we close if you can talk to them. So please feel free to approach them. Again, thank you to our esteemed panelists for your valuable time and knowledge about the Synod and Synodality. Your insights have significantly deepened our understanding about it, and also understanding the call to be more listening, inclusive, and discerning church. Again, thank you. And just a reminder to all who attended, there's a QR code on your table. Please don't forget to complete the form. It will give us a lot of input so that we can shape future programming that are responsive to your needs. So thank you. Let me close by saying Pope Francis beautifully articulated the essence of synodality, saying, "Synodality is a journey that the whole people of God makes together." This emphasizes the importance of every voice, ensuring that no one is excluded. Every Catholic is invited to experience communion, participate fully, and contribute to the mission of the Church. May we all, members of Christ's body, the Church, strive to embody the spirit of synodality, to listen deeply, to engage in open dialogue, and to discern together the path the Lord is guiding us towards. Good night, everyone. Thank you.